Thanks very much. I'm going to be able to just touch on a few aspects of how global diet change could influence future prospects for agriculture, nutrition, and food security. And let me start by just pointing out that in our long-term assessments of global food supply and demand, in fact, we do think there is going to be a significant problem in meeting food demand in the future. And that can be summarized quite starkly in this graph here, which shows projected food prices under our recent impact scenarios, looking at 2010 in the sort of blue or purple line, 2050 under a no climate change scenario, and then 2050 with climate change. And as you can see, even without climate change, we're projecting some significant increases in long-term real prices of food. And with the medium climate change scenarios, this is the A2 scenario, additional pressure is going to be put on prices due to negative impacts on production. Let me go through why we think this is going to happen. First of all, as was alluded to already this morning, there are now growing non-food competitors within agricultural production. Demand for biofuels and bioenergy has already had dramatic impacts on food production and prices. And increasingly in the future, there's going to be a significant demand for agriculture to provide emissions mitigation and carbon sequestration services as well. Some of those will be compatible with continued crop yield growth, such as minimum tillage practices, but others, such as carbon farming or reductions in fertilizer use to reduce nitrous oxide, could again result in reduction of agricultural food production growth rates. In addition, in the longer term, we're going to see as incomes grow that demands for conservation and ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation will be making claims on land and water resources as well. Probably even more significantly are the underlying fundamentals on the supply and demand side. On the supply side, as I already mentioned, climate change in the long run will reduce growth rates in agricultural production and increase the variability in production. In addition, there's now increasing evidence that climate change reduces the nutrient content in many foods, which poses another challenge. There's going to be growing water and land scarcity, particularly in the water sector. The rapid growth in urban and industrial and domestic water demand will be drawing away water from agriculture and also posing water quality issues that could also impinge on agriculture production. To counteract these long-term scarcity issues, of course, there's science and technology policies, investment in agriculture research, policies and governance reform throughout the value chain. And a number of sessions here will be touching on that, so I won't go into detail on that now. In terms of demand drivers, again, we are expecting population to be around 9 billion, maybe 8.5 to 9 billion people in 2050. We were seeing a continued income growth, and in particular now, Africa is a significant factor here. That with the economic revitalization in much of Africa, income growth there will be strong. And in Africa, any given amount of income growth generates a higher demand for additional food because they're starting from lower income and lower consumption growth. Urbanization is a major factor. In 2008 was the first time that half of the world's people were in urban areas. By 2050, 78% of people will be in urban areas. We've already heard some of the major consequences in this in terms of changing diets, some positive, such as increased consumption of fruits and vegetables, but many posing significant risks through demand for more sugar, fats, and oils, and rapid growth in meat consumption and demand for grains for feed. In fact, future projections show that half of the growth in all grain demand, not just coarse grains, will be for feeding livestock. This in turn puts intense pressure on land and water. So given these stresses on the system, what kinds of dietary and food system approaches sort of have been broadly proposed to improving nutrition? So a lot of emphasis has been given to reducing post-harvest losses or wasting less food within households and preparation and eating practices. And indeed, there are significant post-harvest losses, and various estimates range all over the place, and are in fact all over the place due to different conditions. If you want to look at sort of broad averages, it might be 10% for grains, 25% for perishables. So obviously reduction in those numbers and in those losses would be important. But again, it's important to emphasize that these aren't necessarily easy gains, as is often implied in some debates now, that economic recoverability of these losses is limited unless significant investments are made and policy reforms are made in value change to try to capture these losses. It's not a low-hanging fruit as is often implied. Wasting less food in the households is another area, and certainly, particularly in developed countries, through behavioral change could provide some significant gains. Other proposals include shifting to much more sustainable stocks of consumption of fish, and reducing the consumption of meat and dairy products. And what I want to do for most of the rest of this talk is to talk a bit about this issue of, if you reduce meat consumption, particularly in richer countries, can that also improve food security in developing countries through the significant reduction in pressure on resources and a reduction in and resulting reduction in food prices that would lead to more demand in the developing countries. I mean, to start out, I think you need to note that here in this graph, it plots countries and per capita income on the bottom axis, and then per capita consumption of grains on the left axis. That shows, in fact, there's a pretty strong relationship between income growth and meat consumption. When people get more income, most of them want to eat more meat. And obviously, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. You see, for example, China and Brazil sit way above the projected line given the relationship on GDP, whereas other countries like Thailand are well below the line. But it's definitely a strong tendency. It's also worth noting, though, that many countries are clustered down in that lower left-hand corner, eating only 5 to 10 kilograms of grain per capita. At those low levels, in fact, which characterize much of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, increased meat consumption can in fact be an important source of protein and micronutrients. But as incomes grow to the levels you see moving out beyond 30 or 40 kilograms per capita, of course, meat consumption poses increased risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and some types of cancer. So what would happen if, in fact, you could reverse some of those high levels of growth? How would that affect the food security in poorer countries? I need to preface that just briefly by pointing out that, as we heard already this morning, dietary change is not easy. The policy levers to affect dietary change are somewhat limited. Obviously, there's campaigns, so strong campaigns such as, for example, a campaign against tobacco and smoking could be put in place, promotion of low meat menus in cafeterias, schools, and other public institutions. And then moving up forward to much more controversial policies to actually use taxation and subsidy policies to increase the cost of meat relative to other food products. Those can be, of course, very controversial. We're already seeing a backlash in the U.S. claiming that the current administration is proposing fat taxes to change how our liberty to eat whatever we want. Let's go beyond that and say, but what would happen? Let's say we could have substantial reduction in meat consumption in the developed worlds, but also here we're posing it in China and Brazil, which is, as you saw, were also very high meat consuming countries. So here we're showing, run through some scenarios. Again, we have the 2000 base year, a 2030 baseline in the green, and then the 2030 low meat scenario, which imposes a reduction in meat consumption in rich countries, China and Brazil. Of course, the first three set of bars just shows, in fact, shows the exogenous constraint we put on growth in high-income countries, but then traces through how that influences meat consumption in the developing countries. And we do indeed see that then there are substantial increases in meat consumption in the developing countries and in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries. Again, in most of those cases, those would be positive gains in nutrition values from the very low levels that you saw.
Well, 2 minutes.
One of the key things that's one of the key ideas also in reduced demand scenarios is to try to reduce the pressure on the land base. And here again, we do show that you get significant reductions in feed grain demand under the scenario where there's a less meat consumption in the richer countries. But it's worth noting again, comparing the green and the red bars, that here the proportional change in feed demand is much less than that proportional change in meat consumption. It's not a one-to-one reduction. And that's because as prices go down in feed grains, in fact, then you induce a tendency to feed more intensively those feed grains and actually get a shift from pasture to more intensive systems, which reduces the net effect on those sectors. You also then do see that the sort of feed-through effect on the prices of food, of grains in general. But again, here you see that the effect is mainly on the price of maize, so you do get a significant reduction in the price of maize, much less reduction in prices of the primary food commodities, wheat and rice, since they aren't in fact fed, and the links between demand and prices across maize, wheat, and rice are relatively small. You then get also, you do get modest increases in per capita food grain consumption, probably not as much as I think many of us would have expected, because those price differentials just don't result in large enough gains in demand for rice and wheat. And rushing through a bit here to get through, it does then also, if you look at the third set of bars here for developing countries, and this is not including China and Brazil, you do see that there are significant gains in per capita calorie availability, though not huge gains, so that we do get the effect that reduction of meat demand in developed countries does help somewhat in per capita calorie increases. We also estimate that through an empirical econometrically estimated relationship, the effect of changes in calorie consumption on child malnutrition. And here again, you see relatively small changes. One thing to note here also is looking at the purple and green line, is that there's in fact very slow progress in reducing child malnutrition in the baseline scenario. You get somewhat better performance with the low meat scenario, but only about 1 million less malnourished children in sub-Saharan Africa and another 1 million in the rest of the world. But then let's turn shift away from trying to track through those food security impacts to looking at the effect of lower meat production on pasture and cropland area. And here you're starting to get I think, a larger impact that does show some potential for these kinds of dietary transition. Here we look at both two scenarios where only the developed countries reduce meat, and then where China and Brazil also do. As you can see, particularly when China and Brazil are also in the equation, you do get a savings of over 200 million hectares of pasture and cropland under the low meat scenario, and that's becoming quite significant. Anywhere about 8% of total cropland, or 5% of cropland plus pasture land. So you do get those kinds of significant gains on the resource base. Just very briefly, we see that halving of meat consumption in richer countries does have small nutrition benefits in developing countries and significantly larger land-saving impacts. But overall, and so dietary change does show potential, but healthier diets in rich countries should be valued more for their benefits in those countries rather than for presumed effects in developing countries. To get transformative progress in developing countries, you need much broader investment in agriculture and interventions in health and nutrition policies, such as the kinds of much more focused and wide-ranging interventions that are going to be discussed in the rest of this meeting here. Thank you very much.